In a family of elite achievers, we somehow ended up with a useless deadbeat. My dad mocked his cruel voice, cutting through the laughter at my sister's birthday dinner. He looked at me as if I were a piece of trash stuck to his shoe. 42 years old, no career, hiding in her room all day. A complete waste of space. I sat completely isolated at the far end of the table, digging my fingernails into my palms, desperately swallowing my silent tears. I didn't defend myself. I just took the humiliation exactly like I always did. But then the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. My sister's husband, a decorated Navy officer, suddenly froze. His eyes locked onto my face and all the color drained from his skin. He gasped. Dropping his crystal glass to the floor in pure shock, he trembled and stammered, "Seahawk, you're Seahawk." Before I reveal how my brother-in-law's terrified realization completely shattered my father's arrogant delusion, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. You will not want to miss the exact second this fake golden family realized they had just humiliated a living Pentagon legend. Let me take you back to where all of this started. To the life I could never talk about, and the family that used my silence as a shovel to bury me alive. I stared down at my hands. These same 10 fingers had authorized strike packages, directed fleet-wide cyber defense operations, and commanded intelligence assets across 3 oceans, from bunkers carved into rock beneath restricted naval installations. I'd done it surrounded by the blue glow of tactical displays and the constant hum of machines that kept entire battle groups invisible to enemy surveillance. Attaining the rank of Vice Admiral 3 stars. 09 at 42 made me one of the youngest flag officers in the history of the United States Navy. It required a trail of blood, tactical brilliance, and top-secret Pentagon clearances so deep that my entire professional identity was sealed behind a classified call sign, Seahawk. Federal non-disclosure agreements didn't care about my feelings or my family dynamics. I could never wear my dress uniform into my childhood home. I could never explain the sudden midnight extractions when black SUVs with government plates appeared outside my apartment at 2 in the morning. I could never describe the classified war rooms where I sat at the head of the table, 3 gold stars gleaming on my shoulder boards, commanding operations that most flag officers would never be briefed on. To my civilian family, I was a boring government desk analyst who couldn't seem to hold down a normal schedule. A woman who typed on a laptop and didn't have the ambition to climb any ladder worth climbing. My dad weaponized that forced silence on the very first day he noticed the gap. He drove a knife straight through the only wound I couldn't defend because the United States government had legally removed my ability to fight back. At every family gathering, every holiday dinner, every backyard barbecue he orchestrated for his wealthy friends, he'd corner a guest, lower his voice just enough to sound concerned, and ask if anyone knew of a job opening for his eldest daughter who seems to be struggling. He'd shake his head slowly, performing his disappointment like a man delivering a eulogy for someone who was still breathing. The pity in the room was so thick you could choke on it. My sister would catch my eye from across the table and tilt her head at that specific patronizing angle she'd perfected, the one that said she felt sorry for me without having to waste actual words on it. My mother stood in the kitchen doorway during these performances, drying her hands on her apron, her eyes deliberately fixed on the floor tiles. She never interrupted. She never said, "Robert, that's enough." She never redirected the conversation. She just watched the floor and let the silence do its work. Her silence was its own species of cruelty, the kind that left no fingerprints, the kind no court would ever convict, the kind that made you question whether the abuse was even real, because no one else in the room seemed to notice it. My dad needed a shiny trophy to parade in front of his country club circle, and my sister was his custom-built mannequin. I'd stand in the hallway of his house during these orchestrated dinner parties, leaning against the wall near the coat rack, observing him work the room like a campaign manager at a fundraiser. He'd loudly credit his own relentless work ethic and financial acumen for my sister's mundane office promotions that amounted to a new title on a business card and a slightly larger cubicle. He'd pour imported wine for guests who had no idea that the bottle, the table it sat on, and the roof over their heads had been purchased with my military pay. Then he'd glance at me standing in my plain clothes near the hallway and ask loud enough for the entire table to register whether I was still pushing papers at that dead-end government job. He built an entire ecosystem where his self-worth was directly fueled by her manufactured shine. My engineered failure was the dark background he desperately needed to make his golden child glow brighter. Without me at the bottom, there was no pedestal for her to stand on. My sister thrived in this arrangement, the way a parasite thrives when it finds the perfect host, effortlessly, instinctively, without a shred of conscience. She'd sit on the velvet couch in the living room after those dinners, crossing her legs, sipping whatever expensive drink my money had paid for, and deliver unsolicited lectures on ambition and self-improvement. "Have you thought about a temp agency?" She'd ask, examining her manicure with the focused attention she never applied to anything that actually mattered. "Or maybe you should find a good man, someone stable who can take care of you. You know, since the career thing clearly isn't working out." She'd tilt her head always that same angle and let her eyes soften into an expression of manufactured pity. I just nodded. I let my eyes track her micro-expressions the way I'd track hostile signal patterns on a tactical display. The slight flare of her nostrils when she said the word stable. The quick sideways glance at her husband to make sure he was watching her be generous to her pathetic older sister. She didn't want me to succeed. My permanent role as the family disappointment was the load-bearing wall of her entire identity. Remove it, and everything she'd built on top of my failure would collapse into rubble. I refused to argue back. In military intelligence, you never interrupt an enemy when they're busy exposing their own operational patterns. You observe, you catalog, you file, you wait. I sat in the corners of my dad's house cataloging their narcissism with the same cold precision I used to log incoming threat assessments in a fleet command center tracking frequency intensity source pattern. I told myself my silence was a superior form of discipline. I told myself I was operating above their petty civilian drama the way a satellite operates above weather. That was the lie I needed to keep breathing. Because the brutal naked truth, the truth I couldn't face during those long drives back to base, gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2 with my jaw locked and the radio off, was that every single degrading comment, every sideways glance, every time my dad introduced me to a guest with, "And this is my other daughter," or simply forgot to introduce me at all, each one carved another notch into my ribcage. Invisible wounds. Wounds that don't bleed where anyone can see. Wounds that don't show up on x-rays or fitness evaluations, but wake you up at 3 a.m. with your heart pounding and your hands gripping the sheets, and a voice in your skull asking you why the people who were supposed to love you can't seem to remember your name. I kept returning to that house because somewhere deep in the most damaged part of my gut, a broken voice still whispered that if I just endured long enough, took enough hits, swallowed enough insults, one of them would finally see me. That voice almost destroyed me. And it nearly bankrupted me first. Right after I returned from my third forward deployment, a rotation that left me with chronic tinnitus in my left ear and an equipment malfunction scar across my right wrist, from an emergency extraction, my dad's carefully polished empire nearly crumbled. He'd made a string of catastrophic ego-driven investments. A speculative Arizona real estate deal that collapsed when the market corrected. A restaurant franchise he'd bragged about at the country club for months that went belly up in 16 weeks. A cryptocurrency scheme a golf buddy had talked him into after 3 whiskeys. Every single bet was designed not to generate profit, but to generate conversation, to give him something impressive to say at dinner parties. The losses were staggering. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on the family home. I found him in his study at 2 a.m., slumped in his leather chair, a foreclosure notice stamped in red ink sitting on the desk in front of him. He was clutching his chest, not from a heart attack. From the sheer animal terror of losing the only thing he actually worshipped, his social standing. He didn't look at me when I walked in. He couldn't. My military training hijacked my logic before my heart could catch up. You never let your people fall. That was the doctrine hammered into my skull through years of command, the sacred bleeding principle that you do not abandon your own, no matter what. I sat down at his desk, pulled my phone from my pocket, opened my encrypted banking portal, and wired him $70,000. My flag officer's pay accumulated over years of deployments in classified locations. Money earned in war rooms where the air tasted like recycled dread and the decisions I signed off on carried the weight of human lives. I transferred it without hesitation, without negotiation, without a single condition attached. I saved his house. I saved his reputation. I saved the country club membership that mattered more to him than his eldest daughter's existence. He took the money paid off the bank and never once, not a single time in the weeks and months that followed, said the words, "Thank you." He started planning my sister's wedding 3 days later. Not a word about the foreclosure. Not a word about the wire transfer. Not a single acknowledgement that his eldest daughter had just rescued him from financial annihilation with money earned in places he couldn't find on a map. The subject was simply closed, filed away in the same mental drawer where he kept every uncomfortable truth and replaced by the next project. 3 days. That was the shelf life of $70,000, 3 days before it was digested, forgotten, and the mouth opened again for more. The demands arrived like artillery fire, one shell after another. Imported ice sculptures from a specialty company in Vermont. Exotic flowers flown in from Ecuador, specific species my sister had bookmarked on a bridal magazine website. A 5-course tasting menu designed by a caterer whose sole purpose was to impress my brother-in-law's high-ranking military family. The reception venue was a historic estate outside the city with stone columns and manicured gardens. The string quartet alone cost $4,000. My sister wanted personalized calligraphy on the place cards. My dad wanted premium bourbon and Cuban cigars for the groomsmen. They were secretly flat broke. Every cent of my bailout had been swallowed by the mortgage, so they turned to the only member of the family still producing cash. They didn't ask. They informed. My dad called me from the house phone, his voice carrying that specific tone of manufactured urgency he deployed when he needed money. "Your sister's wedding reflects this entire family," he said, each word loaded like a round in a chamber. "Do not embarrass us." From a classified command center operating on 3 hours of sleep and cold black coffee, I authorized the bank transfers that paid for every orchid, every ice sculpture, every bottle of bourbon, and a wedding cake that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The reception was a masterclass in psychological amputation. I sat at a small round table near the kitchen doors, positioned where the waitstaff walked past without making eye contact. My chair had a wobbly leg. The tablecloth had a wine stain from a previous event that nobody had bothered to replace. I wore a plain navy dress from an outlet store, no jewelry, no accessories. The kitchen behind me smelled like industrial dish soap and overcooked vegetables. 30 feet away under crystal chandeliers, my father stood at the head table and tapped his microphone with his index finger. He delivered a tearful 15-minute toast. He credited his own decades of hard work, relentless grind, and personal financial sacrifice for giving his youngest daughter this magical, unforgettable night. He choked up, actually produced tears when he described how he'd moved mountains to provide for his family. He thanked the caterers by name. He thanked the valet drivers. He thanked the florist, the venue coordinator, and the string quartet. He raised his glass to my sister, to her husband, to God, to the great country that made their family's success possible. He never looked in my direction. Not once during those 15 minutes did his eyes drift toward the table near the kitchen doors. My $70,000 were invisible. My service was invisible. I was invisible. My mother sat beside him at the head table, clapping softly at the appropriate pauses, her eyes locked on the centerpiece orchid arrangement, so she wouldn't accidentally meet mine. "Just keep the peace," she'd whispered to me that morning, pressing a tube of lipstick into my hand as though cosmetics were a form of armor. As though looking pretty could protect me from being erased. I gripped the edge of my tablecloth, my knuckles grinding against the rough linen until they turned bone white under the dim overhead light. I rationalized the searing pain the way I'd been trained to rationalize operational losses in the field. Leaders absorb the cost. Real commanders operate in the shadows. Flag officers don't require civilian applause. I was projecting the sacred honor code of my military service, the doctrine that had kept me alive through decades of classified warfare, onto a family of parasites who would drain my veins dry and step over my body to reach the dessert table. I willingly locked myself inside their psychological prison and convinced myself the cage was a medal of honor. The lipstick my mother had given me sat unused in my clutch. The evening ended with my sister slow dancing with her new husband while my dad beamed from the head table and his friends applauded, and I sat in the back alone, listening to the kitchen staff scraping plates clean behind the swinging doors. Then the phone calls started again. They always started again. My actual life, the one my family would never know existed, was a relentless campaign of digital warfare commanded from deep inside windowless facilities that smelled like recycled air, burnt circuit boards, and the sour sweat of people who hadn't seen sunlight in days. A rogue state hacking syndicate had breached a critical naval logistics server. The breach threatened to expose the real-time coordinates of active undercover operatives embedded in hostile territory across 3 separate theaters of operation. If those coordinates leaked, people died. Not hypothetically, not theoretically. Real people with names I knew, faces I'd briefed, families I'd personally assured that their loved ones were in good hands. For 48 straight hours, I commanded the response from a freezing operations center, my eyes bloodshot and burning, directing teams of cyber warfare specialists through encrypted channels, personally authorizing firewall protocol rewrites to contain a data hemorrhage that could have compromised an entire generation of intelligence assets. I ran on black coffee so bitter it scorched my throat, tactical adrenaline that made my fingers tremble, and the cold understanding that every second wasted was a second closer to someone's body bag. When my team finally sealed the breach, zero data loss, all operatives confirmed safe. I collapsed into my chair, pressed my palms against my closed eyes, and listened to my own heartbeat decelerate from combat speed. My eyes had been closed for maybe 6 minutes when my personal phone vibrated against the metal desk beside my head. The buzzing sounded like a trapped hornet, angry and insistent. I reached for it without opening my eyes. It was my sister. She was sobbing. Hysterical, sloppy, gulping sobs, the specific frequency she produced exclusively when she needed something expensive or difficult. She'd partied away her final semester, skipped lectures to attend brunch dates, missed every major deadline, plagiarized a draft paper from an online database, and got flagged by her university's integrity software. She was about to fail her prestigious master's program, and if she failed, she couldn't maintain the fiction of being the brilliant, accomplished wife that her husband's military social circle expected. Her entire identity, the one my father had assembled for her like a doll on a shelf, would collapse. Before I could process a single word, she handed the phone to my dad. His voice came through the receiver like a blade wrapped in velvet. "If you care about this family's reputation at all," he said, "you will fix your sister's mess." He paused just long enough for the weight of the threat to settle. Then he hung up. I sat in that chair, my vision blurring from 48 hours without sleep, the taste of bad coffee still coating my tongue like engine oil. I opened a blank document on my classified workstation, using my advanced intelligence analytics training, the same methodology I deployed to map hostile communication networks, track enemy cell structures, and predict operational patterns across multiple theaters of conflict. I spent the next 2 days constructing her entire master's thesis from nothing. I cross-referenced geopolitical datasets, structured her argument using analytical frameworks that my own intelligence staff would have respected, cited academic sources with the precision of someone trained to build evidence packages for congressional oversight hearings, and formatted a flawless 60-page document while my vision swam and my wrists screamed from the strain. My sister was at a nail salon 40 miles away getting a French manicure. She submitted my work under her name without changing a single comma, a single citation, a single paragraph break. A month later, the university awarded her highest honors. My dad threw a party for 30 guests. He made a speech about the intellectual brilliance that runs in our family's DNA. I bought a modest new dress. I pressed it carefully, hung it on the back of my apartment door, and allowed myself the small, pathetic luxury of imagining a seat at her graduation celebration dinner. Maybe near the middle of the table this time. Maybe close enough to hear the toasts and the laughter. Maybe, just maybe, someone would acknowledge the late nights, the research architecture, the 60 pages of flawless analysis that had transformed a failing party girl into a summa cum laude graduate. I knew no one would say my name. I wasn't naive enough to expect that. I just wanted to exist in the same room as the achievement I'd built with my own bleeding hands. The phone call came 4 hours before the event. My sister's voice was flat and deficient, the tone of someone canceling a dental appointment. "Look, my husband's high-ranking Navy friends are going to be there," she said, each word landing like a slap. "Your whole depressed, unemployed loner vibe is going to bring everyone down. It's better for everyone if you just stay out of sight." The line went dead. I stood in my apartment holding the phone against my ear long after the call disconnected, staring at the new dress hanging on the door. The blank wall behind it stared back. I'd just saved her academic career on zero sleep 48 hours after commanding an operation that saved the lives of real human beings in a real war zone, and my reward was a dial tone and a closed door. I left the dress on the hanger. I didn't eat dinner that night. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark and pressed my thumb against the scar on my wrist until the physical pain drowned out the other kind. Months later, I completed a brutal 3-month forward deployment in the Pacific Theater. Classified, relentless. 91 days of compressed darkness, digital warfare, and sustained operational pressure that rewired my nervous system and taught me to sleep with one eye open and my hand on a secure phone. A mission that hollows you out and fills the empty space with something harder than bone. Something that keeps you functional, but makes you question whether you'll ever feel soft things normally again. I stepped off a military transport plane, my skeleton still buzzing from the G-force, my eardrums ringing my boots, hitting civilian tarmac for the first time in 91 days. I drove straight to my parents' house for a holiday dinner because the broken compass inside my chest still pointed toward that front door. I pushed through the heavy oak entrance, dropping my duffel bag onto the hardwood floor with a thud that nobody acknowledged. The house smelled like expensive roasted meats and cinnamon candle smells designed to communicate warmth, designed to say, "You're home." For one brief stupid second, I let myself hope that my dad would walk over, hand me a glass of water, and say 2 words, "Welcome home." That was all I needed. 2 words and a glass of water. Instead, I walked into the living room and found my dad gripping my brother-in-law's shoulder like he was presenting a prize stallion at auction. My sister's husband stood in his pristine '03 lieutenant uniform, his modest service medals catching the light from the overhead fixture. My dad's voice boomed through the house with the confidence of a man standing on a stage he'd built himself. "You are the absolute pride of the United States Navy." He bellowed, his chest inflating, making absolutely certain his words carried to where I stood in the doorway, still holding the strap of my duffel bag. "It is a profound honor to have a real contributor in this family." He paused. He locked eyes with me. That cruel practice smirk curled across his mouth like a snake settling into position. Not like some useless people who just sit around pushing papers at a government desk. He held my gaze for 3 full seconds, savoring the impact the way a boxer savors a clean hit. I sat at the far end of the dining table, pushing overcooked carrots around my plate without lifting the fork to my mouth. My sister raised her crystal wine glass and peered at me over the rim with an expression she'd rehearsed in the mirror. "You know the real world outside your little cubicle actually runs on hard work," she said, her voice dripping with the sweet manufactured condescension of someone who has never worked hard at anything in her life. "Just like my husband does. You type reports all day that nobody reads. You couldn't possibly understand the pressure of actually protecting this country." My jaw locked so hard I felt something click deep in my skull. I dug my fingernails into both palms, pressing until the skin split, and I felt the warm sting of broken capillaries. 1 week ago, 7 days, I had personally authorized the cyber defense grid that shielded her husband's exact fleet from a hostile missile targeting system. I didn't just outrank him. I was 6 ranks above him, a 3-star vice admiral commanding the intelligence apparatus that kept his ship afloat and his crew alive. One encrypted order from Seahawk determined whether his entire battle group survived or burned. The irony sat in my throat like a live grenade with the pin half pulled, and I swallowed it down with a mouthful of cold water and kept my eyes on my plate. The campaign of erasure shifted into its final, most methodical phase over the following weeks. My dad systematically cropped me out of every family photo posted online. Thanksgiving portraits, backyard barbecue snapshots, group shots at restaurant dinners, I was digitally amputated from each one with the clean, practiced precision of someone removing an unwanted object in photo editing software. He didn't just ignore me in person anymore. He was retroactively removing evidence that I had ever existed within his family at all. As if I'd never been born. As if I'd never stood in those rooms, never smiled for those cameras, never paid for the food on those tables or the clothes on their backs. I discovered the deletions one night on my phone, scrolling through his social media feeds during a break between classified briefings. Each missing image was a small surgical incision. I counted 11 photos from the past 2 years. In every single one, the space where I had been standing was either cropped out or filled with a slightly distorted background, the digital equivalent of painting over a person in a family portrait and hanging it back on the wall. Then the final blow landed. My sister's 28th birthday. My dad booked a VIP room at an exclusive downtown restaurant, white tablecloths, crystal glassware, imported champagne, specifically designed to parade my brother-in-law in front of their wealthiest social contacts. I didn't receive an invitation. I didn't receive a text. I didn't receive a phone call. I found out about the dinner from my mother, who sent a secret message at 11 p.m., the screen glowing in my dark apartment. "Come if you want, but dress nicely and please don't speak. You'll embarrass your sister." I read that message 3 times. I sat in the dark for 10 minutes. Then I put on my gray coat, got in my car, and drove to that restaurant, knowing with absolute clarity that I was walking straight into the kill zone. The broken soldier inside me couldn't stop marching toward the ambush. Not yet. And that brings us back to the exact moment everything detonated. The VIP dinner. My sister's 28th birthday. The crystal glasses, the white tablecloths, the imported champagne, the warm laughter of wealthy strangers who'd spent the past hour watching my father publicly dismantle my worth like a man pulling wings off a fly for entertainment. The echo of him calling me a useless deadbeat was still bouncing off the restaurant walls when my brother-in-law's champagne glass hit the tile floor and exploded. The O3. Lieutenant the Golden Boy, the trophy son-in-law, the living monument to my father's desperate obsession with military prestige, was staring at me the way a man stares at a loaded weapon he didn't know was in the room. His pupils were blown wide, the tendons in his neck pulled taut as steel cables. He recognized something. Not my face. He'd never truly looked at my face before tonight. Not once, not in all the dinners and holidays where I sat in the background like furniture. He recognized my voice. The flat, unblinking cadence he'd heard through encrypted radio channels 6 months ago in a classified theater of operations, when a call sign Seahawk had hacked a rebel communications grid and pulled his trapped unit out of a lethal ambush with 37 seconds to spare. He'd heard that voice give the order that saved his life and the lives of every sailor under his command. Seahawk was a ghost, a legend whispered about in officer briefings and wardrooms. Nobody knew Seahawk's face rank or real name. And now the lieutenant was staring at the source, sitting in a cheap chair at the far end of a birthday dinner table with broken fingernails and a gray coat draped over the back of her seat. The cognitive dissonance cracked him open like an egg. He didn't care about the elite guests watching. He didn't care about the melting birthday cake or the imported champagne or the social choreography his father-in-law had spent weeks arranging. His military conditioning seized control of his body before his conscious mind could intervene. A reflex drilled into muscle memory through years of naval training as automatic and unstoppable as a knee-jerk test. He took a sharp, frantic step backward. His spine snapped straight rigid as a steel beam. His boots slammed together with a violent crack that split the ambient noise of the restaurant in half and made my father physically flinch, his hand jerking toward the edge of the table for balance. My brother-in-law's right hand shot up to his brow in the sharpest, most desperate military salute I had ever received. And I had received salutes in classified war rooms from combat-hardened captains who commanded warships. Vice Admiral. His voice detonated through that VIP room like a concussion grenade. The crystal light fixtures rattled on their chains. A woman at the next table dropped her fork with a clatter. A waiter carrying a tray of dessert stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth hanging open. The entire restaurant, every guest, every server, every person within earshot seized up in the sudden suffocating silence that follows an explosion. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. The only sound was the faint, high-pitched ringing of the chandelier crystals, still swaying from the force of his voice. My father's smug grin wasn't just removed from his face. It was torn off and replaced by something I'd never seen him wear before. Genuine, uncontrollable confusion mixed with raw animal dread. His mouth opened again, the desperate, involuntary gaping of a man whose brain had just received information it fundamentally could not process. My sister turned the color of wet chalk, her manicured fingers clamping onto the edge of the table so hard that her knuckles turned yellow-white and one of her acrylic nails cracked against the wood. The wealthy friends the audience my father had hand-selected to witness my degradation sat frozen in their chairs, their expensive forks suspended in mid-air, their eyes darting between the saluting officer and the woman in the gray coat that everyone had been laughing about 10 minutes ago. I didn't rush it. I let 3 full seconds of crushing, airless silence fill the room. 3 seconds in which every person at that table had to sit inside the reality of what they were witnessing. Then I placed both palms flat on the tablecloth and stood up. The transformation was instantaneous, and it was violent. The hunched, diminished civilian posture I'd worn like camouflage for 42 years. The rounded shoulders, the lowered chin, the averted gaze peeled off my body like dead skin being shed. My shoulders squared, my spine locked into the rigid alignment that had been forged through decades of command and combat operations. I rose to my full height, and the sheer physical change was so sudden, so extreme, that 2 guests at the adjacent table instinctively shoved their chairs backward. I was no longer the family disappointment hiding in the shadows. I was Vice Admiral Martha Scott, call sign Seahawk, 3-star flag officer in naval intelligence, and every molecule of authority I carried into classified command centers Every ounce of power I'd wielded over life and death decisions in restricted war rooms was now radiating off my body in that restaurant like heat from a reactor core. "Glad you made it back alive, Lieutenant Wykes," I said. My voice dropped into the register I reserved exclusively for classified command centers, low steady, carrying the lethal weight of someone who'd authorized fleet-wide defensive operations and directed combat extractions across hostile territory. A voice that ended debates before they started. My brother-in-law's salute arm was trembling. He held it for 3 agonizing seconds, then snapped his arm down with a crack that echoed off the walls. He pivoted on his heel to face my father. The expression on his face had shifted from shock to something far more dangerous. The purple volcanic fury of a man who has just discovered that everything he was told by the people he trusted was a calculated, deliberate, sustained lie. "You called her a parasite," he shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief, so raw it sounded like something tearing. "Sir, the woman you just humiliated in front of this entire room is Seahawk. She's a 3-star vice admiral in naval intelligence, one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire United States Navy. She commands operations that you don't have the clearance to hear about." He jabbed his finger toward me without breaking eye contact with my father's collapsing face. "She personally saved my entire unit from a kill zone 6 months ago. She's 6 ranks above me. She holds the lives of thousands in her hands, including mine. And you sit here calling her a deadbeat." My dad stumbled backward, his hip catching the edge of his chair, his mouth opening and closing in the suffocating silent panic of a fish pulled out of water and dropped on a dock. No sound came out. His eyes were darting desperately around the room, searching for a single friendly face among the guests, and finding nothing but shocked disgust and the dawning recognition of exactly what kind of man had been hosting their dinner parties for the last decade. If you know the deep, vindicating satisfaction of watching toxic narcissists finally get exposed in public, hit that like button and share your own survival story in the comments. I was no longer their punching bag, and my next move was going to be completely merciless. The silence that followed my brother-in-law's explosion lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then my father's survival instinct kicked in, not the survival instinct of a man facing a physical threat, but the far more desperate instinct of a narcissist watching his social armor crack in public. Sweat beaded on his forehead like condensation on a cold pipe. He forced a grotesque shaking laugh that came out sounding like a dog's cough. "Son, you're confused," he sputtered, grabbing the back of his chair for balance, his eyes still scanning the room for an exit that didn't exist. She's my daughter. She pushes papers at some government desk. She doesn't." My brother-in-law stepped forward, invading my father's personal space with the aggressive forward lean of an officer trained to dominate any room he entered. "She is Vice Admiral Scott," he said, his voice dropping to a growl that severed my father's pathetic sentence at the root. "Call sign Seahawk. And if I ever hear you disrespect her stars again, I will make it my personal mission to ensure every officer and official in this state knows exactly what kind of man you are." The delusion didn't crack. It didn't chip. It detonated from the inside. I didn't say a single word to my family. I didn't need to. I reached across the table, calmly picked up my gray coat, the same cheap coat my sister had mocked, the same coat my mother had told me to dress nicely to cover up, and slung it over my shoulder. I looked at my father, not with rage, not with grief, not with the bleeding, desperate hope that had dragged me back to this family for 4 decades. I looked at him with the dead, flat, purely analytical gaze I reserved exclusively for hostile targets in the field subjects I'd already classified, cataloged, neutralized, and filed away. In that exact second, standing in that restaurant, surrounded by shattered crystal and shattered lies, I was no longer their family. They were no longer my responsibility. They were hostile liabilities, and I was cutting them from my operational reality with the same cold efficiency I'd used to sever a compromised communication line in a combat zone. I turned and walked toward the exit. The physical transformation was complete, and it terrified every person in that room. I wasn't shuffling like the family scapegoat anymore. I was marching with the heavy, unshakable, ground-eating cadence of a flag officer crossing a command deck during battle stations. My boots struck the hardwood floor in precise, measured intervals that echoed through the silenced restaurant like a metronome, counting down to 0. My shoulders were squared. My chin was level. My eyes were fixed on the exit. The elite guests, the same people who'd been chuckling at my father's jokes about my unemployment 10 minutes ago, the same people who'd sipped wine I'd paid for and nodded along, while a narcissist dismantled his own daughter for sport, scrambled out of my path as if I were carrying live ordnance through a civilian corridor. They pressed their backs against the upholstered booth walls. They pulled their chairs in with panicked scraping sounds. They averted their eyes, suddenly fascinated by their napkins, their water glasses, the pattern on the tablecloth. Anything to avoid making eye contact with the woman who had just gone from being the evening's joke to being the most powerful person in the building. One man knocked over his champagne glass, trying to get out of my way, and nobody moved to clean it up. The authority radiating off my body was physical, tangible, and suffocating, and every civilian in that restaurant could feel it compressing the air around them, like the pressure change before a storm. I reached the heavy oak doors at the front of the restaurant. Behind me, the silence was total, except for my father's ragged, panicked breathing and the distant sound of my brother-in-law's boots on the floor. Then my sister's voice, thin, trembling, stripped of every layer of condescension she'd spent a lifetime building, drifted across the room like the last signal from a dying radio. Wait! I didn't stop. I didn't turn my head. I pressed both palms against the oak doors and pushed them open. The night air hit my face cold and clean and free of the sickly sweet smell of expensive perfume and cheap lies. I felt the psychological chains I'd worn for 42 years disintegrate into dust on the pavement behind me. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my secure phone, and initiated the most brutal tactical maneuver in the entire military. Playbook total, uncompromising, absolute radio silence. I blocked every civilian contact linked to my former family, every number, every email address, every social media connection. As of that moment for them, I simply ceased to exist. I climbed into my car, pulled the seatbelt across my chest with steady hands, started the engine, and drove toward the base. I didn't check the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me worth a backward glance. By 7 a.m. the next morning, my personal phone was buzzing itself across the metal shelf in my quarters like a mechanical insect in its death throes. I sat on the edge of my rack, lacing my boots, listening to the device vibrate against the cold steel surface. My father had left 14 voicemails in 2 hours. I picked up the phone and played the first one for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to hear the grotesque mutation of his voice. The contempt was gone. Father replaced by a sickeningly sweet, greedy desperation that made my stomach contract like a fist. Honey, Vice Admiral, 3 stars. My God, why didn't you ever tell us, listen, we are throwing a massive celebration for you at the country club. Call me back, sweetheart. He didn't care about the abuse. He didn't care about the 42 years of humiliation. He wanted to mount my stars on his living room wall like a taxidermied trophy. Another decoration for his fake kingdom, another piece of someone else's achievement to claim as his own. That was his first instinct. Not remorse, acquisition. I deleted every message without listening past those first 4 seconds. I opened my Contacts app and began the systematic purge with the calm mechanical precision of a commander dismantling a compromised network node by node. My father's number deleted and blocked. My sister's number deleted and blocked. My mother's number. My thumb hovered over her name for 3 seconds. 3 full seconds. I thought about the lipstick she'd pressed into my hand on the morning of the wedding. I thought about just keep the peace. I thought about every dinner where she'd stared at the centerpiece flowers instead of looking at me, every holiday where she'd stood in the kitchen doorway and watched my father tear me apart without opening her mouth once. I thought about the secret text message she'd sent about the birthday dinner. Please don't speak, you'll embarrass your sister. And I realized that her silence had never been neutral. It had never been passive. It was a choice made over and over for 42 years to protect the system that fed her comfortable life at the cost of her eldest daughter's sanity. Blocked. I opened my email and routed every address associated with my family to a dead folder that would auto-purge every 24 hours. Then I drove to the base security office and filed a formal access restriction request. 3 civilian license plates were entered into the installation's perimeter blacklist system. The duty officer processed the paperwork without asking a single question. He just glanced at the 3 stars on my shoulder board, said, "Yes, Admiral, board," and entered the data. In warfare, cutting the enemy's communication lines is how you break their operational capacity. I denied my father the one thing his narcissistic disorder required to function an audience. I sealed him inside a soundproof box of irrelevance and let him suffocate on his own silence. The void worked faster than any weapon system I'd ever deployed. Within 2 weeks, a military public affairs journal published an unclassified photograph of me receiving the Defense Superior Service Medal at the Pentagon. Standard protocol for unclassified commendations, routine publication widely circulated among military and defense communities. The photo showed me in full dress uniform, 3 gold stars gleaming on my shoulder boards, shaking hands with the Chief of Naval Operations in a wood-paneled ceremony room lined with flags. My father found it online. What he did next was the most predictable move in the narcissist's playbook in a frantic, flailing attempt to rewrite history. He downloaded the photo and posted it on his social media account with the caption, "So proud of my amazing Vice Admiral daughter. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." 3 American flag emojis, a heart emoji, a praying hands emoji. The same man who'd called me a deadbeat in front of 30 people, who'd cropped me out of every family photo for years, who'd used my money to fund his failed investments and his daughter's fake wedding, that man was now claiming my 3 stars as his personal product. He genuinely believed he could edit reality the way he edited photos. The same digital tools he'd used to crop me out of family portraits were now being deployed to paste himself into my success story. The irony was so precise, it almost felt engineered. He was catastrophically wrong. My brother-in-law shattered that delusion with the thoroughness of a demolition crew. Disgusted by what he'd witnessed at the dinner, disgusted by the family he'd married into, disgusted by the years of lies he'd been fed like poisoned food, he told the truth. All of it. He told his fellow officers. He told their wives. He told the country club contacts my father had spent decades cultivating like prize roses. The story ripped through their social circles like wildfire through dry brush. The wealthy patriarch who'd publicly degraded his own daughter for decades, while secretly living off her flag officer's pay, stealing her intellectual labor, and parading her sister's manufactured success as his own achievement. And the daughter he'd been calling a deadbeat, a 3-star vice admiral. Call sign Seahawk, one of the most powerful intelligence officers in the United States Navy. The backlash was immediate, merciless, and public. My father's former friends turned on him with the particular viciousness that only betrayed allies can produce. They left comments on his Facebook post, the one with the flag emojis, exposing the truth beneath every sentence he'd written. They tagged their networks. They shared the Pentagon photo next to screenshots of his old posts where he'd cropped me out of family pictures. My sister was quietly but firmly dropped from her elite officers' wives club. The invitations stopped arriving. The lunch dates dried up. The phone went silent. The immaculate golden family portrait my father had sacrificed my sanity, my savings, and my self-worth to construct was chemically dissolved in public view, and the rotting canvas underneath was visible to everyone who cared to look. My sister couldn't survive outside the ecosystem my father had built for her. Without the social scaffolding, without the dinner parties and the brunch dates, and the admiring glances from people who didn't know the truth, she had nothing to stand on. Her marriage was fracturing. My brother-in-law could barely share a room with her. Her manufactured friends had vanished the moment the family's reputation became a liability rather than an asset. A few weeks after the total social collapse, the base security guard radioed my office on a Tuesday afternoon. "Admiral, there's a civilian female at Checkpoint Alpha causing a significant disturbance. She says she's your sister and she's demanding access to the installation." I set down my pen. I looked at the clock on my office wall. I let 30 full seconds pass. Then I authorized a brief meeting at the gate perimeter. Brief, at the gate, not inside. I walked to the checkpoint in full dress uniform. Every step was measured, deliberate, loaded with the weight of 3 gold stars on my shoulder boards, and every ribbon and medal arranged in precise military formation across my chest. I walked the way I'd walk into a Pentagon briefing where the Secretary of Defense was in attendance, chin level, spine locked, eyes forward, face set in the impenetrable stone mask I wore when the information being discussed carried life or death consequences. I was no longer Martha the Disappointment. I was Vice Admiral Scott callsign Seahawk, and the full institutional power of the United States Navy was standing behind me, around me, and inside me. She was on the other side of the yellow security line, standing on cracked civilian asphalt that was baking in the afternoon sun. She looked different, diminished. The cheekbones that used to radiate pampered health now jutted out at sharper angles. Her hair, always salon perfect, was pulled back in a hasty knot that she wouldn't have been caught dead wearing 6 months ago. The designer sunglasses pushed up on her head had a scratch across the left lens. Without the protective architecture of our father's dining room, without the crystal glasses and the white tablecloths and the captive audience of admiring strangers reinforcing her specialness every 30 seconds, she was nothing but a fragile, disassembled woman in expensive clothes that no longer told the story she needed them to tell. I stopped 3 feet behind the yellow line, my hands clasped behind my back, my posture identical to the stance I held during military ceremonies where admirals and generals flanked me on both sides. I didn't greet her. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a single word. I just looked at her and let the sheer crushing physical weight of my rank, my uniform, my stars, my scars, and my silence do all the work. She came apart. Her knees buckled and she dropped onto the hot asphalt right there in front of 2 armed security guards and a concrete barrier, sobbing in a way I'd never heard from her raw, ugly, convulsive sobs that racked her entire body. "I am so sorry," she wailed, her fingers hooking through the chain-link fence like claws. "You paid for my wedding. You wrote my thesis. I was blind. I was so incredibly blind. Please, my husband won't look at me. Dad is destroyed. Please, I need you. Please forgive me. I want my sister back." Mascara ran in black rivers down her cheeks. Her designer blouse was smeared with dust from the asphalt. Every word, every sob, every trembling syllable was a precision-guided emotional weapon designed to activate the old software buried in my nervous system. The programming that said, protect her, fix her, absorb her pain, sacrifice yourself so she can keep standing. She was betting her survival on the version of me that used to sit at back tables and grip tablecloths until her knuckles turned white. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I looked at her with the cold surgical calculation of a flag officer confirming target classification. Zero emotion. Zero negotiation. "You aren't crying because you hurt me." My voice came out flat and precise, echoing off the concrete barriers in the open air between us. "You're crying because my actual rank threatens your fake authority. I poured my own blood into shielding this family, and every single time you used the cover I gave you to stab me in the back." I let the words settle. I watched her face collapse, and I searched my own chest for some trace of the old pain, some flicker of the bleeding loyalty that had kept me chained to these people for 4 decades. I found nothing. Clean. Empty. Cauterized. The old software had been permanently uninstalled on the night I walked through those oak restaurant doors. I turned on my heel. Crisp. Military. Final. "Access denied," I told the guards. 2 words. The same 2 words stamped on every classified door I'd ever walked through. The guard stepped forward, closing the gap. Behind me, my sister screamed something, my name, another apology, another sob engineered to pull me back into the orbit of her collapse. I didn't hear the words. I was already walking back toward the base, my boots striking the pavement in the measured, unbreakable cadence of someone who had finally, permanently, cut the last infected thread connecting her to a wound that had been draining her for 42 years. Months passed after that. The silence held like a sealed bulkhead on a submarine, airtight, pressurized, absolute. I stopped checking my blocked messages folder. I stopped scanning social media for traces of my family's unraveling. I stopped wondering what my father was telling his dwindling circle of associates, stopped analyzing whether my sister's marriage had finally collapsed, stopped running post-operational assessments on people who were no longer part of my mission or my life. The scar tissue formed thick and clean over the places where the old wounds used to bleed, and underneath it something unfamiliar grew, a quiet, almost unsettling peace that I didn't fully trust at first. Peace that only settles in when you finally stop fighting a war that was never yours to win, and never should have been yours to carry. I rebuilt my daily rhythms around my work, my command, and the small hard-earned pleasures of a life that belonged entirely to me. I was attending a high-level Department of Defense honors gala at a secure facility in Northern Virginia, standing in a loose circle with 2 4-star admirals discussing next-generation cyber defense architecture when I caught movement at the edge of my peripheral vision. A shape that didn't fit the room. My father. He'd managed to get into the event on a pity ticket from a distant acquaintance, some minor defense subcontractor who owed someone a favor and didn't know the full story. Robert Scott was standing near the buffet table, holding a glass of cheap white wine in a hand that hadn't stopped shaking since the night his world fell apart. His suit didn't fit right anymore. The shoulders sagged. The collar gaped. He looked older, smaller. His spine had developed the permanent inward curve of a man whose internal scaffolding had been demolished. Surrounded by 4-star admirals, 3-star vice admirals, senior intelligence officials, and combat-decorated officers who'd earned their places in this room through decades of service and sacrifice. My father looked exactly like what he had always been beneath the country club blazer and the imported wine. A small, frightened civilian standing in a world that operated on blood clearance levels and currencies he would never possess. He spotted me across the ballroom. I was standing under the main chandelier, my dress uniform pressed to inspection standards, 3 gold stars gleaming on my shoulder boards, every medal and ribbon in its precise regulatory position. The Defense Superior Service Medal caught the light, and I saw it, that old, sickening, predatory flash in his eyes, the same expression he'd worn when he paraded my sister's fake diploma in front of his dinner guests. The expression of a man who sees prestige and immediately begins calculating how to absorb it, claim it, stamp his name on it. He shuffled across the polished marble floor toward me, each step hesitant and uncertain, his cheap shoes making soft, apologetic sounds against the stone. The admirals in my circle noticed his approach. They straightened slightly, eyeing him with the quiet, instinctive suspicion that senior military officials reserve for unvetted civilians in restricted spaces. One of them glanced at me. I gave a micronod that said, "No threat, just a civilian." My father stopped 2 feet in front of me. His hands were trembling against the wine glass. His chin was quivering. His eyes were wet, not with genuine grief, but with the manufactured tears a narcissist produces when they need something, the physiological byproduct of a desperate egos, grasping for purchase on a surface that no longer exists. "I just wanted to say," he whispered, his voice thin and reedy, stripped of every ounce of the booming, room-commanding authority he'd used to terrorize me at dinner tables for 42 years. "I am so incredibly proud of you." A year ago, those 6 words would have shattered me. I would have folded into his arms and wept and forgiven everything and let the cycle start again from the beginning. I would have wired him another $70,000 without being asked. I would have written another thesis, organized another wedding, paid another mortgage, absorbed another toast that erased my name from the family ledger. I would have sat at another back table near another kitchen door and watched him take credit for another decade of my life, while my mother stared at the flowers and my sister examined her nails. A year ago, those words were the only currency I accepted, the only validation I craved, the only payment that could settle the debt I believed he owed me. I had spent 42 years building a temple to those 6 words, and I would have burned everything I'd earned just to hear them spoken once with sincerity. Now they landed on my skin like drops of water on glass, present visible, sliding off without leaving a mark. I felt no rage, no bitterness, no grief, no satisfaction. I felt the specific, profound nothing that exists on the other side of a war you've already won and walked away from. I looked at my father the exact way I'd look at a lost civilian who'd wandered onto a restricted floor and needed someone to point him toward the exit. I gave him a single nod. Small, polite, the kind of nod you give a stranger who holds a door open for you. "Thank you," I said. My voice was set to the exact register I used with foreign liaison officers at international joint briefings, courteous, professional, and entirely empty of personal attachment. "Have a good evening, sir." I turned my back on Robert Scott and stepped directly back into my conversation with the admirals, resuming my sentence about encrypted network resilience as if there had been no interruption. Behind me, I heard the small shuffling sound of his shoes, hesitating on the marble. The sound of a man standing in front of a door that had been welded shut from the inside, realizing too late that no amount of knocking would ever open it again. I didn't glance over my shoulder. I didn't wonder what expression he was wearing. I didn't care. True power was never about screaming for recognition. It was never about proving your worth to people who had made a career of devaluing you. True power was the ability to stand in a room full of admirals and generals, look the man who broke you directly in the eye, feel absolutely nothing, and walk away. My family buried me in the dark for 42 years so their cheap halos could burn brighter. They didn't realize that the dark was my operating environment. I was recruited for it. I was trained in it. I was forged inside it. I built an entire career in classified war rooms with no windows, no sunlight, and no applause. I became Seahawk in those rooms, a call sign that moved fleets and silenced enemies and commanded the respect of officers who would never know my face. And now, standing under the chandeliers of a Department of Defense ballroom, my 3 stars reflecting the light my father could never generate on his own, I was leaving him and everything he represented behind me in the darkness they chose, permanently. Without grief, without ceremony, without a single backward glance. Never let toxic bloodlines convince you that you are worthless just because they cannot comprehend your silent strength. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and comment below if you have ever had to walk away from family to finally find your own peace.